Welcome back, learning birds. In this video we're going to be talking about the point of view of the narrator in To Kill a Mockingbird and the element of flashback to the narrative. Now first of all, as you know, To Kill a Mockingbird is written from the perspective of a young girl, Scout Finch, and it's written in the past tense. Now from very early on in the text, in fact in the opening page, after Scout speaks of Jem and his arm injury, she says, "When enough years had gone by to enable us to look back on them, we sometimes discussed the events leading to his accident." Now from this line and a few others in the text like it, we know that Scout is retelling the story years and years after it's happened. She's retelling it as an adult. However, even though there are lines like this in the text, they appear very rarely. So even though she's retelling the story as an adult, the perspective is still synonymous with that of the young Scout we experience in the story. I believe at the beginning of the text she is about 4, and by the end of the text she is about 8. And we know this because of how many times Jem is telling her that she's not yet 9. So because the story is told from Scout's childhood perspective, it creates this authenticity. Her tone is very often naive and childish, and examples of this are when she's asking questions like, what does entailment mean? What is rape? She's asking all these questions that a child would ask and an adult would already know. And when she explains things, she also explains them the way she understood them at the time. There's very rarely any input from her older adult self. It's very rare that the point of view shifts to her older adult self, and the aim of this is to keep that authenticity intact. Although I mentioned flashbacks before, you might be asking yourself where in the story a flashback occurs because it's kind of confusing, but the answer to that is that the entire story in and of itself is a kind of flashback. Because at the beginning we recognize Scout to be an adult and she's going back and retelling her story from a much earlier point in time. The reason it feels like a flashback and not a regular linear narrative told in the present is because of that very authenticity we just discussed, which is generated by her childhood perspective. Now, in case that wasn't clear enough, it might be easier to think of it as a child's story being told through an adult structure, an adult vocabulary. So even though an adult is telling the story, the tone and the perspective, that remains a child's. The interesting thing here, though, is that while we may regard this point of view and this childlike perspective to be naive, by the end of the text we can see that Scout's naivete actually plays a role in her not understanding concepts like racism and why people can be agents of racism. All this time we may think she's being naive, but in the end it's that very naivete that makes her a more moral human being who believes in equality and general human goodness. So her being naive is actually an advantage to her. At one point during the court case, Dill feels sick and has to go outside, and Scout goes with him, and they encounter Mr. Dolphus Raymond, who explains that he pretends to be drunk so that people have a reason to accept his lifestyle, which consists of being with the blacks and breeding mixed children. Anyway, the important thing here is what he says to the children when they ask him why he's confessing to them, and he says, "Because you're children and you can understand it." And I believe that's something that's reflected beautifully in the writing. There are certain things that children understand that adults don't. Or in this case, there are certain things that children don't understand that adults do, like racism and why it's perpetuated, which lends to a better understanding of equality and human goodness, because that understanding hasn't been compromised. It hasn't been hindered in any way by prejudice and racism the way it has with the better half of the community. Because the point of view is from a child, we're given a better understanding as the reader as to how wrong racism is and how wrong the treatment of the blacks is in the novel. And that's incredibly superb and thoughtful craftsmanship on part of the author, Harper Lee. So well done, Harper. Well done. But anyway, you can see the connection there, yes? That's perhaps why the perspective is the way it is, because it shows a child's understanding of the world, and a lot of the times a child's understanding of the world is a lot better, a lot truer, and a lot more pure than an adult's, especially when adults are crippled by things like racism. But yeah, that's pretty much all there is to it. The perspective is very important in the text. It creates authenticity. It allows the adult version of Scout to inject more mature explanation of things in the text when it's needed, like when she's explaining things like miscarriages of justice and other ideas that children wouldn't necessarily understand. And it's written this way because it indirectly argues that although a child's understanding of the world might be naive, it doesn't make it wrong. It doesn't make it any less valuable. And Atticus even said a similar thing to Jem near the end of the text. He said, "If you had been on that jury, son, and 11 other boys like you, Tom would be a free man." So even that quote there, which is, oh my god, so sad by the way, it's heartbreaking, it shows that a child's understanding, a child's perspective is, a lot of the times, purer than adults. And it's that purity that Harper Lee creates so damn well in her perspective through Scout's voice. I hope that helped, guys, or I hope that at least made sense. Please rate this video as helpful, and thank you for watching. If you're staying tuned to this series, I'll see you in the next video. Otherwise, take care, and I'll see you next time. All the best.